What happened to the children of Nazi camp commanders executed after World War II? The most shocking case is that of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. Captured by British authorities after months in hiding, he was tried for crimes against humanity in Poland. On April 16, 1947, he was executed by hanging right in front of the former crematorium at Auschwitz I, the epicenter of the horror he oversaw. During his trial, his wife and 5 children lived under false identities. At the time of his execution, his children were in hiding in Germany, with no certainty as to whether their father was still alive or dead. One of the most famous sons is Hans-Jürgen Höss, who for years denied knowing what was happening at the camp, even though his house was just a few meters from the crematoriums. Another son, Klaus Höss, kept his distance from public life. The eldest daughter, Inga Brigitte, also lived in silence, avoiding interviews or public appearances. Decades later, his grandson, Rainer Höss, he would become a public voice against Nazism, trying to break with the legacy of blood that his surname carried. Rudolf Höss, the man who became synonymous with the Holocaust. Höss was born in 1901, and his father, a strict and religious man, wanted Rudolf to become a priest. Rudolf himself states in his memoirs that the episode that changed his course took place when he was 13 years old. In a violent incident at school during a fight, Höss pushed another boy down the stairs, breaking his ankle in the fall. He confessed his guilt to the priest but didn't tell anyone at home. However, on Sunday after Mass, Höss's father beat his son and severely punished him for the incident. Young Rudolf realized that the priest had violated the seal of confession. According to him, that episode was enough to change his destiny. The truth is that the following year, his father died suddenly, and he, lying about his age, joined the German army. The First World War had broken out. His youth did not prevent his courageous actions and the receipt of several awards. He served in regiments stationed in Palestine and North Africa. When news of the armistice and the German defeat reached those distant lands, he and several of his comrades decided not to resign themselves to being captured by the English. They undertook an unlikely return home that took several months and involved numerous detours. They spent an unprecedented amount of time in Romania, for example, and many dangers. He wasn't even 18 yet, but Rudolf Höss had already suffered enough. In 1923, with one of the leaders of his group, Heinrich Himmler, they executed a plan to assassinate a professor who, according to them, had betrayed a German resistance fighter. Höss was the executor, and the police discovered his authorship. They arrested him, tried him, and found him guilty of homicide. He received a 10-year prison sentence, but in 1928 he benefited from a general amnesty. At the beginning of the following decade, he joined the Nazi Party, and with his determination and obedience, he rose through the internal hierarchy. Himmler, already very close to Hitler, remembered old times and valued his loyalty. In 1934, and already an active member of the SS, he was appointed block leader at the Dachau camp. This meant he was in charge of a barracks with several hundred detainees. He remained there for 3 years until his assignment to Sachsenhausen. It was a promotion. He was second in command at the camp. He had the power to make decisions and exercise it. A couple of years later, he was appointed commandant of Auschwitz. His promotion was swift, and he was determined not to let his superiors down. In the midst of his frantic rise to power, he met Hedwig. Hensel, they married and had 5 children. Klaus, Heidetraud, Inga Brigitte, Hans-Jürgen, and Annegret. Höss transformed Auschwitz into a gigantic conglomeration of death. He said his concern was to make the camp efficient and to prevent the injustices he had witnessed in others. In fact, he expanded the facilities, intensified the use of slave labor, which was what made Auschwitz efficient, and swiftly eliminated those unfit for the job. Auschwitz now consisted of 3 main areas: the slave labor camp, the administrative section, and the extermination camp, where anyone who entered was murdered within hours. Höss led the most brutal death factory ever created. From that moment on, he became known as the Animal of Auschwitz. In 1941, he was summoned from Berlin and told confidentially that Hitler had ordered the final solution, the total extermination of the Jews. What he did was try to optimize resources to carry it out, how to kill more people in the shortest time possible. So he tried different methods, from mass shootings to Zyklon B gas, which was introduced by Höss. The use of this gas was the idea of one of his subordinates, Karl Fritz. Höss decided to put it into practice and boasted about it. "Since the victims died in the gas chambers, life in the camp changed. We no longer had to endure those terrible bloodbaths caused by the shootings," he wrote. At the end of 1943, everything changed for him. The Allies were advancing, Germany was crumbling, and accusations about him were piling up on the desks of Nazi leaders. One of them claimed that he had impregnated one of the detainees, Eleanor. Hodis, and upon learning of the situation, assigned her to a cell so cramped one could only stand. A few weeks later, the woman had lost her pregnancy. Several of these stories and suspicions of corruption led to his dismissal from his position. He was assigned to an administrative position in the general management of the concentration camps. But a few months later, after a storm erupted over some internal conflict that had harmed him, he was recalled and once again placed in charge of Auschwitz. A special and horrific task awaited him. He had to liquidate a voluminous cargo because that's what he meant by the people arriving at his camp. He was tasked with exterminating 450,000 Hungarians in record time. Höss's thoroughness, efficiency and ruthlessness shone through once again. It was called Operation Höss. The massacre was on such a scale that the enormous crematoriums weren't enough. Once again, bodies had to be piled up in mass graves. Killing people wasn't a problem. We could eliminate them at about 2,000 an hour. But cremation was slower and more laborious. We were never able to solve that problem. He was also the one who ordered the death march. With the Soviet army approaching, he ordered the retreat on foot of tens of thousands of prisoners who were no longer strong, didn't even have shelter, and were a paragon of disease. He exposed them to cold and hunger. He condemned them to a certain and painful death. And anyone who weakened, who stumbled and couldn't get up, he ordered them to be shot to set an example. Meanwhile, Höss was thinking about how to escape. He knew that if he were captured, his future would be bleak. First, he disguised himself as a member of his country's navy, then as an ordinary citizen, and finally as a peasant. He managed to remain a fugitive for more than a year. He came to believe that they would never find him again. He communicated occasionally with his family. When everything calmed down, he longed to be reunited with his wife and 5 children. He always prided himself on being a family man, on leaving work problems outside his home, even though his family home was located within the Auschwitz complex. When the spectacle of what happened at work upset me too much, I couldn't return home to my family. I would saddle my horse and, riding, try to free myself from my obsession. When I was invaded by memories of incidents during the extermination, I would leave the house because I couldn't remain surrounded by my family, he explained in his memoirs, trying to create an image in which the mass murderer coexisted peacefully with the exemplary family man. One afternoon, an Allied patrol knocked on the door of his family home. They asked for his whereabouts. Neither his wife nor his children responded. They beat the sons and threatened to hand them over to the Soviet authorities, who would undoubtedly send them to Siberia. The mother decided to protect her children and told them her husband's whereabouts. After his arrest, he was taken as a defendant to the Nuremberg trials. There, he implemented his defensive tactics, the same ones he would use in the trial against him. He was only following orders from the High Command. He had no choice but to do so. At one point, one of the prosecutors said that in his concentration camp had murdered more than 3.5 million people. Rudolf Höss interrupted him somewhat indignantly, but without raising his voice. "It was only 2.5 million. The rest died of disease or hunger," he said coldly, sending shivers down the spines of everyone present. Höss, who shielded himself behind submission to his superiors, compliance with the current legal system, and loyalty to his country, was driven by other motives. His pursuit of power, money, and success surpassed any other motivation. This boundless ambition was what drove him to rise, regardless of the atrocities committed along the way. He was sent to Poland for trial. There in Auschwitz, the place where he committed his crimes, he was sentenced to death. On April 16, 1947, his sentence was carried out. The gallows on which he was hanged had been built a few years earlier on his orders. Persecuted family, the fate of the family and children of the beast of Auschwitz. After Rudolf's death, the Hussars decided not to speak of the subject again and turn the page to start a new life. However, they had to go through difficult times, such as hunger, stealing coal for heating, and simply not having any shoes. From then on, Hedwig, Klaus, Heidetraud, Inge, Brigitte, Hans, Jürgen, and Annegret were never the same. From the beginning, each of them went their own way. Hedwig sought to rebuild her life in Germany, where she remarried and later moved to the United States with her new husband. Few details exist about what happened to her, but it is known that she lived peacefully in Washington until her death, although it is unclear at what age she died, as some sources indicate she was 81, but others claim she could have lived as long as 90. The eldest son of the Höss family, Klaus, was the one who helped support his family until he emigrated to Australia with his German wife Lisolette, nicknamed Lilo. Klaus and Lilo remained in Sydney, where they raised their only daughter, Christine, although they later divorced. In the mid-1980s, Klaus died of liver cirrhosis caused by excessive alcohol abuse. The remaining siblings of the Höss family, Annegret, Hans, Jürgen, and Heidetraud, appear to have vanished from Earth. The only information available about them is that they continued to live in Germany after World War II, although it is unclear whether they are still alive. However, Hans Jürgen's descendants have made a name for themselves. It turns out that his son, Rainer Höss, decided to become a sort of amateur researcher and historian to expose his grandfather's crimes. In fact, he wrote a book about his search within his family history, and has spent many years giving talks in different cultural spaces and dedicated to the memory of the Holocaust, to the point that he was adopted as an adult by an Auschwitz survivor. However, it was quite controversial, as some journalists have accused him on several occasions to use his last name to extract money and obtain benefits. In fact, Rainer was criminally convicted 13 times, usually in cases related to fraud or embezzlement, most recently for fraud in August 2020. Jürgen's eldest son, Kai-Uwe, an evangelical pastor who had so far kept a low profile, confronted his brother, saying that everything he does is sensationalist and false. Moreover, he asked Rainer to stop defrauding people by using the names and ashes of millions of Holocaust victims. Finally, of all Höss's children, the most influential was Inga Brigitte, who changed her name simply to Brigitte. Brigitte Höss, Rudolf's daughter, who became a model and kept in touch with famous Americans. Although her family tried to move on, trying not to attract attention and avoid being associated with the Nazi past, the shadow of Auschwitz was too great and weighed heavily on the Höss family. Brigitte couldn't stand it any longer in Germany and left for Spain. She believed that in a new land she would have a better chance of starting a new life, and the girl was right. In her youth, she was an imposing woman, Inge. Brigitte was tall, confident, with a long neck, a firm smile, and eager eyes. Her figure enabled her to quickly make her way. She was 27 years old, but seemed timeless. A German beauty, icy, sophisticated, intriguing. A chance encounter allowed her to find not only direction in her career, but also to enter a world that would shelter her and where her possibilities for advancement and leaving the past behind were a reality. Cristobal Balenciaga, already an important designer with a significant impact on fashion, met her at an event and was immediately dazzled. He immediately offered her a job as a mannequin for his brand, as models were called at the time. Balenciaga, already a legendary designer at the time, legitimized her with his choice. No one asked Brigitte for too many explanations about her past. Truly, it was better for everyone not to know. When someone inquired about her orphanhood and loneliness, she said her father had died in the war. She omitted some details. In any case, Spain was still under Franco's regime, so it was a sort of accessible zone for former officers, civil servants, and other Nazis seeking refuge in Europe. Brigitte became one of the couturier's favorites, who called her "my little German soldier." Through her work, she met Hollywood actresses, members of the nobility, influential figures, and Carmen Polo, the wife of dictator Francisco Franco. After so much suffering, she once again lived surrounded by luxury, like her home outside Auschwitz. She had left poverty and life behind. On the run, the atrocious paternal crimes. Also, her surname instead of Hoss was called Brigitte Hensel, using her mother's surname. She didn't want anyone to associate her with the Holocaust. Then she met an Irish-born American engineer who occasionally worked in Madrid. They married, and she followed her husband's career paths: Iran, Vietnam, Lebanon, Liberia, and Greece. It was no trouble leaving the catwalk. She no longer needed pseudonyms or her mother's surname. From then on, she would use her married name. They formed a nomadic family, had 2 children, and only settled permanently in Washington in 1972. For a long time, she hid her origins from her husband. When she confessed who her father was, he was understanding. "You were just another victim," he told her, and they agreed not to speak of the subject again. They separated in 1983. She had 2 more marriages and worked at Saks, Jandel, a luxury boutique, for more than 3 decades. Once again, the clientele was exclusive: Jackie Kennedy, Barbara Bush, Hillary Clinton. Once, after a party, her inhibitory brakes loosened by alcohol, she confessed her past to the store manager. The next morning, he told the store owners, a German-Jewish couple who had to flee their homeland after Kristallnacht. They told Brigitte that her job was not in danger, that no one was guilty of her parents' crimes. She worked with them for 35 years. Brigitte hid her story until, after turning 80, she was diagnosed with cancer. After her diagnosis, she decided to meet with Thomas Harding, an American journalist and writer who was writing the book Hans and Rudolf, a chronicle of how her great-uncle Hans Alexander, a captain in the United States Army, had captured Hoss in 1946. Harding tracked Brigitte for years, following false leads but never getting discouraged, until one day he achieved what seemed impossible, finding her and getting her to talk. There, she told him about her days in Auschwitz, her escape, the Balenciaga years, and her later life. But the condition was that she not reveal her address or her married name so that no one could associate her or her family with the Nazi war criminal. However, in that conversation she said that her father seemed like the best man in the world, always sweet and kind to those around him. And she even resorted to denial when trying to defend her father. If there were so many millions of dead, why are there so many survivors? When Harding reminded her that her own father had admitted to 1 million victims at Auschwitz, she claimed that her British captors had tortured her into confessing. Brigitte characterized her father as just another member of the SS. Someone forced by circumstances to follow uncomfortable orders which he couldn't refuse because otherwise his family would be in danger. "If you didn't do what they told you, they would kill us," Brigitte stated. However, this could never be proven by any contemporary evidence. In reality, Rudolf Höss was an ambitious and opportunistic man. His frantic pursuit of power, wealth, and comfort led him to rise rapidly in the Nazi hierarchy. He did what he had to do to keep moving up. In Höss, as in other Nazi leaders, there is ambition and conviction, ruthlessness and premeditation. His actions were never the result of inertia. If he didn't kill anyone with his own hands, it was only because he had a battalion of people under his command. He did what he had to do to maintain his power and his privileges. And if they had been in danger, he would have done whatever was necessary without any scruples. He was an executioner and a criminal. They called him the Animal of Auschwitz. Brigitte maintained, not without reason, that she was a child at the time. "I never knew anything about the killing and the aberrations. I did see the chimneys, the barracks, and the barbed wire, but I never asked about them. What if I had known? What would I have changed if I had been 7 or 10 years old?" she stated. The truth is that children cannot be held responsible for the actions of their parents, and it is not incomprehensible that at some point Brigitte wanted to defend Rudolf's memory, perhaps not for the press, but for herself. Arthur Liebehenschel, the brutal successor to Rudolf Höss at Auschwitz. Arthur Liebehenschel, born in 1901 in Krakow, was a Nazi official who directed the Auschwitz concentration camp in 1943 after Rudolf Höss left office. Arthur Liebehenschel was an SS Obersturmbannführer with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He began his career in the SS in 1934 as an adjutant officer at the Lichtenberg concentration camp. In 1936, he was transferred to the concentration camp directorate in Berlin. In 1942, the WVHA, the SS Central Economic and Administrative Office, was established to administer the finances, supply systems and commercial projects for the Allgemeine SS, the largest branch of Himmler's paramilitary organization. In the newly formed Group D offices for the concentration camps, he took over the central office, Office D1. On 1 November 1943, he succeeded Rudolf Höss as commandant of Auschwitz Central Camp. Liebehenschel initiated a new phase in the history of Auschwitz. His reforms were first implemented in Block 2, which housed the police and political prisoners. He suspended the periodic selections and the resulting executions in the bunker. Executions were not only carried out, but were carried out further away from the main camp, in the Birkenau crematoria. He ordered the dismantling of the cells in which inmates could only stand, as there was no room to sit or lie down, and in which detainees had been kept until then as punishment. He declared a general amnesty for the bunker and ordered the dismantling of the Black Wall, as the execution wall at the extermination camp was known. He also revoked the order to execute those arrested for attempting to escape. From then on, all prisoners captured during the escape were to be transferred to another concentration camp. However, the selection and extermination at the camp continued. In 1944, he was replaced and transferred to the Lublin concentration camp, Majdanek, as commandant. After the evacuation of that camp in July 1944, he was transferred to Trieste, to the office of the higher SS and police Führer Odilo. Globoksnik, in 1947, Liebehenschel was sentenced to death by the Supreme People's Court in Krakow, where he was executed. Until then, little was known about his family, as the leader had separated from his wife and abandoned his daughters. However, several decades after the trials of the Nazi officers, one of Liebehenschel's daughters came forward and decided to tell her story. Selective memory, Barbara Cherish, Liebehenschel's daughter who tried to tell another story. Barbara Cherish was adopted after World War II by an American family and kept the identity of her biological father a secret for decades. At 47, Barbara Cherish was at a crossroads. Her children were grown, but her marriage was over. Her beloved older sister, who had been a surrogate mother for her when she was young, had recently passed away. Her whole world had fallen apart, and suddenly a thought invaded her mind. This was the time to confront the secret she had hidden for so long. That secret lay buried in a drawer upstairs. It was a photograph of a man whose gaze, Barbara said, was thoughtful and sad, a man whose existence she had never dared admit. It was her father. The photograph revealed the terrible truth about him. In the picture, Arthur Liebehenschel is wearing a military hat, a hat that clearly displays Hitler's SS insignia and the skull of the concentration camp personnel. Barbara's father was no ordinary SS officer. He had one of the most terrible jobs imaginable. He was the commandant of the Auschwitz camp. "My father had a terrible job," was the first thing Barbara, a 66-year-old grandmother living in San Diego, California, would say when she first started seeing the press. "But I couldn't keep it a secret anymore. I had to figure out who and what I was, both to find out where I came from and for any other reason." At the time, Barbara wanted to tell the truth for her son and granddaughter, as well as for herself. "I don't want there to be any more secrets in our family. No matter how bad the truth was, I wanted it to be known." Barbara, called Bärbel when she was born in Nazi Germany in 1943, began her search at that crossroads in 1988, following the death of her sister. It was the beginning of a journey that has lasted more than 20 years. The end point of the process was the publication of a book detailing all the information she has been able to gather about Liebehenschel and his life. Barbara, at that time, was not seeking to exonerate a man who had played such a central role in the final solution. However, she could not and would not avoid being the daughter of that monster. If there was any good to be seen in him, she, unsurprisingly, wanted to find it. She highlighted his less terrible gestures, such as when he was put in charge of Auschwitz, which freed prisoners from the infamous Block 2 and ended executions at the Black Wall. Auschwitz survivors, some of whom Barbara has contacted and interviewed, have told her that their father, although guilty of his part in Nazi atrocities, did what he could to help some of the prisoners. And Barbara also claims to have spoken to Anneliese, Liebehenschel's lover, who recalls how he would come home from the camp in tears before taking long showers and long walks. None of this, of course, amounts to a pardon, and Barbara was always very aware that there would likely be criticism of what she did. She wasn't looking to make excuses, but rather to at least give some context to what her father did, although it ended up being far more favorable than historians would have liked. In her book, she describes him as a man who loved military life, who was a career soldier, who perhaps wanted to escape the horror but didn't know how. She even, in a passage that caused much controversy and offended many people, dared to compare her father to Oskar Schindler, who saved thousands of Jews from death, something that earned her, at best, the disapproval of the families of Holocaust survivors. What's fascinating about Barbara is that the man she managed to view with the greatest possible benevolence was not only a war criminal, but he also abandoned his mother, leaving her to raise their 4 children alone. It was precisely this abandonment that caused Gertrude's nervous breakdown, Liebehenschel, after which Barbara was eventually adopted and sent to the United States with her new family. So the man she tried so hard to love is responsible not only for immeasurable public suffering, but also for immense private pain. Nevertheless, she has spoken about what it was like to be the child of a Nazi after Germany's defeat. She recalls one day when the family's suitcases were stolen at a train station, leaving her, her sisters and her mother penniless and with only the clothes on their backs. The following winter was so cold that Brigitte, her older sister, contracted tuberculosis. At one point, the family was so hard up that she and a friend sat on the street begging. Her other sister, Antje, recalls, for example, how prisoners from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where her father had worked before Auschwitz, would come to the house to build a greenhouse. One of the prisoners would often carry Antje on his shoulders, promising to build a theater in her house one day. The story of Gertrude, Barbara's mother, is also tragic. After losing her husband to another woman, she was ridiculed after the war as the wife of an SS officer. Her descent into mental instability is painstakingly described by Barbara in her book, as she tries to understand why her mother takes her and Antje on a 2-week walk through fields and forests from their home in Germany to their former holiday home in Austria. In reality, they were being kidnapped by their mother. Eventually, their older sister Brigitte, who was 16 by then, tracked them down and rescued Eberl, who was starving. Brigitte and Eberl were taken in. In fact, Barbara never saw her mother again, and Gertrude died in 1966 in a mental institution after being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. A couple of years after being rescued by Brigitte, Barbara was adopted by Brigitte's husband's American sister and brother-in-law, giving Barbara a new father who had fought for the Allies against Hitler. Leaving her family behind was very hard, but traveling by boat to America and starting a new life there was extremely exciting. Barbara recalls, "Every day was a new adventure for me. I remember arriving in New York and driving upstate, and my eyes following the road with such curiosity, imagining a new life opening up around every corner. I missed my old family, of course, but starting over was wonderful." Her American family moved first to New York and then to California, but Barbara's new mother warned her never to mention her father's past to anyone in the United States, and for 3 decades, she told no one. For Arthur Liebehenschel, too, the story ends in silence. By the time he was hanged for war crimes in 1948, he had been in prison for 3 years and died without knowing what had become of the family he had abandoned. At his trial, Liebehenschel denied any knowledge of what was happening at Auschwitz, which Barbara says is incredible. "He lied during interrogation, that's pretty clear," she said. "We can only speculate about why he lied and how much he lied. But there were times when he seems to have gone to Berlin to try to stop the transports. The truth is, the picture is complex, but it's clear that he knew more about what was going on than he claimed at the trial. It must be strange to feel sorry for a war criminal who had undoubtedly lost the rights he took from so many other human beings, but decades later, and from the other side of the world, his youngest daughter is still saddened because her father's last days must have been lonely. I didn't know where we were or what had become of him, us, not even if we were still alive." In his last letter to his wife, he tells her how strange it is that there has been no news or trace of his daughters, and I find it very tragic. Although he kept the truth secret, Barbara showed that every aspect of her life during all those years was under the shadow of her father's Nazi past. Stepping out of the shadows and naming that history allowed her to bring closure. Once, she says, she had a dream in which two hands reached out from the sky towards her. They were covered in long black gloves, and she was terrified to realize they were searching for her. Yet the moment the hands touched hers, she felt what she describes as an overwhelming sense of love and peace. Liebehenschel may have been a monster, but he was also a father, and his daughter has never forgotten that. For a minute of fame, Rolf Mulka, the Olympic athlete who caused his father's arrest, Robert Karl Ludwig Mulka was an SS captain, deputy to Rudolf Höss, commandant of the Auschwitz extermination camp and participant in the Holocaust during World War II. The son of a postal worker, Mulka completed his secondary education at the Realschule in Hamburg, served in the military for a year, and then became an apprentice in a merchant's firm. In August 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, he volunteered fighting in France, Russia, and Turkey, earning the rank of lieutenant. At the end of the war in November 1918, he joined the Baltic Guard, a far-right paramilitary force that sought to prevent the spread of Bolshevism in the West. In 1920, he returned to Hamburg and rejoined the merchant community. That same year, a court sentenced him to 8 months in prison and 2 years' loss of civil rights for mishandling funds confiscated from leftists during his service in the Baltic Guard. Mulka consistently denied any wrongdoing. In 1931, he founded his own company to import and export products, while remaining a reserve officer, eventually being promoted to first lieutenant. Due to his legal problems, he was discharged from the army. Mulka voluntarily joined the SS on the 8th of June 1941. In early 1942, he was assigned to the Auschwitz extermination camp, where he was told he would be serving in a large concentration camp with a farm and requiring supervision. In May 1942, he was appointed SS deputy to Rudolf Höss, the camp commandant, and his office was located next to the gas chamber and experimental crematorium at Auschwitz-Thürend. In March 1943, he was arrested by the SS for criticizing a speech by Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda of the Third Reich. However, he was soon released and the charges were dropped. He returned to Hamburg, where he remained until the Allied bombing of the city, and volunteered for the SS command in the North Sea. In early 1944, he was reassigned to the SS engineering school in Prague. While there, Mulka became seriously ill and was discharged. He returned to Hamburg, where he remained until the Nazis surrendered in May 1945. Between 8th June 1945 and 28th March 1948, he was interned in several prisoner-of-war camps, including Eiserbruck, Neumünster, Eselleider, Paderborn, Fischbeck POW camp, and Neuengamme. Upon his release from the Allies, he was arrested by a Hamburg denazification court and sentenced to 18 months in prison for his involvement in Auschwitz. However, the sentence was revised and Mulka's status was downgraded to level 5, allowing him to return to work indefinitely. Mulka was married and had 2 sons and a daughter. His eldest son had died as a soldier in World War II. However, following this prison term, Mulka refounded his import-export company, and his son, Rolf, became an Olympian. Rolf Theodor Heinz Mulka was born seamanship. Unlike his older brother, who died in the war, Rolf devoted himself to sports in various sailing categories. In 1943, he became German junior champion in the pirate category. At the 1956 Summer Olympics in Melbourne, he finished 6th in the Sharpie event. In 1956 and 1957, he was world champion in flying. Dutchman. However, the most striking moment of his life would come in 1960, when Rolf Mulka and fellow German Ingo von Bredau won their medal in the flying category Dutchman, a two-person sailing competition. Mulka had already won the world. In Germany, someone noticed his rather unusual surname. Actually, at the time, only 10 people with the surname Mulka appeared in German telephone directories, and so the question arose: could Rolf be related to Robert Mulka, second in command of the Auschwitz concentration camp in 1942 and 1943? Rolf's brief appearance, Mulka's involvement in the Roman case, led a Frankfurt prosecutor to locate his father, Robert, who, as mentioned, had become a businessman living in Hamburg. The 1963 to 1965 court case against Robert Mulka and others, known as the First Frankfurt Auschwitz Trial, changed West Germans' perspective on the Nazi past. In early 1964, the prosecutor's office managed to obtain several purchase orders from IG Farben signed by Mulka, requesting that several batches of the pesticide Zyklon B be sent to the camp for special actions, the code name for the exterminations. From that moment on, Mulka was arrested and placed at the disposal of the tribunal. During the trial, Mulka denied all knowledge of the extermination of Jews and Roma. As with the gas chambers, however, the evidence of pesticide purchases and crematorium maintenance signed by him was overwhelming in proving his responsibility, to which he remained silent. After 183 days of hearings, between August 19th and 20th, 1965, the verdict was announced. Mulka was charged with complicity in the murder of at least 750 people on 4 separate occasions and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Mulka was sent to Kassel prison, where he unsuccessfully attempted suicide. In 1968, he became seriously ill and finally died in April 1969 while still in prison. Thus, his son's triumph sealed a terrible fate for Robert Mulka. For his part, Rolf distanced himself from sports, both because of his family name and his age, and decided to take over the importing company his father had started after World War II. Rolf ran the company until his retirement, and finally died at the age of 82, leaving family in Germany with a profile completely removed from political or social life. Irmfried Eberl, the brutal Nazi euthanasia doctor. Irmfried Georg Rolf Eberl was a German-Austrian physician who between 1940 and 1942 served as medical director of the Brandenburg and Bernburg extermination camps as part of Operation T4, and later, in the summer of 1942, as first director of the Treblinka extermination camp as part of Operation Reinhardt. As a young man, Eberl decided to study medicine, and in February 1935 he received his doctorate. After leaving university, he worked as an assistant physician at the Rudolf Foundation Hospital in Vienna and at the Grimmenstein Lung Sanatorium. His membership in the Nazi Party in 1935 prevented him from finding permanent employment in Austria, so he left for Germany in 1936. After various temporary positions in organizations such as the German Hygiene Institute in Dresden, the Public Welfare Office in Dessau, the Lung Sanatorium in Berlin-Lichtenrad, and the Berlin City Rescue Office, Eberl moved to the Central Health Office in Berlin as a scientific fellow, where he found longer-term employment. After separating from his longtime partner and fiancée, Emmy Begus, Eberl married Ruth Rehm, a department head in the Women's Office of the German Labour Front and a Go-Frauenwalterin in the National Socialist Party's foreign organisation DF on June 23, 1937, in Bregenz. In January 1940, he and other doctors were drafted into Operation Action T4, a secret program for the extermination of the mentally ill and disabled through what was known as assisted euthanasia. During this time, they participated in the first trial gassing of patients at the Brandenburg Sanatorium. On February 1st, 1940, Eberl received a position in the Charitable Foundation for Institutional Care, the front company that covered up the sinister activities of the T4 organization, and began his service as head of the Nazi extermination center in Brandenburg. There, to the extent he was present, he personally carried out all the gassings. The surviving pocket calendar shows that he gassed Jewish patients for the first time on July 10th. In November 1940, following the dissolution of the Brandenburg institution, he took over the direction of the new Nazi extermination center in Bernburg and moved there with the staff of the Brandenburg institution. There, Eberl wrote a compendium for doctors on alleged Nazi euthanasia, with 61 sample reports of natural causes of death that were as credible as possible. As part of the TOT organization, Eberl was deployed in January 1942 as a hospital doctor to Minsk on the Eastern Front, responsible for the care and transport of the wounded to rear hospitals. After this mission, he worked for Operation Reinhardt, the secret Nazi plan during World War II to exterminate Polish Jews in the territory of the General Government of Occupied Poland. On April 24, 1942, he was at the Sobibor extermination camp, already completed but not yet inaugurated, when the first test gassing was carried out. By June 1942 at the latest, he was at the SS and police headquarters in Warsaw, responsible for the material needs of the new Treblinka extermination camp. On July 22, 1942, the liquidation of the Warsaw ghetto began. The next day, the first Jewish victims from Warsaw arrived at Treblinka. By the end of August 1942, Treblinka's extermination machinery had collapsed. Thousands of corpses lay scattered throughout the camp, and the camp staff could no longer bury them in mass graves. Their superiors, Odilo Globoknik, who was in charge of carrying out Operation Reinhardt in the general government, and Christian Wirth, inspector of the extermination camps who were present at the scene, held Eberl responsible for the conditions prevailing in the camp. This was followed by a suspension from duty, and his post was taken over by the camp director, Franz Stangl, who had been recalled from Sobibor. Eberl subsequently returned to Bernburg for duty, although his activities after the dissolution of this institution at the end of July 1943 until 1945 are unknown. He was allegedly called up to the Wehrmacht on 31 January 1944 and trained at the Grenadier Training and Replacement Battalion 203 in Berlin-Spandau. Nevertheless, documentary evidence shows an authorization from the Central Office of the German People's Party of the 1st of June 1944 to purchase foreign currency and to undertake a business trip on behalf of the Reich government to Slovakia in July 1944. First wife, Ruth, died on 30 July 1944 in Marienbad. Finally, in January 1945, Eberl joined the Panzer Grenadier Training Regiment 902 in Luxembourg as a medic and was taken prisoner by the Americans after 3 months. At the Dietersheim PODU camp, he served in the tuberculosis department. On July 6, 1945, Eberl was released from captivity. Afterwards, penniless, he settled as a doctor in Blaubeuren, Swabia, with his in-laws, where he was initially able to practice without interruption. He married for the second time in October 1946. His second wife, Gerda Friederike Eberl, née Poppendick, gave birth to a son, Immo Eberl, on May 12, 1947. In the summer of 1947, the Stuttgart prosecutor's office was alerted by the American military authorities about a doctor stationed in Blaubeuren with the name of the former director of the Bernburg Euthanasia Institution. Interrogation of Eberl by the American and German authorities did not provide any clarification. After contacting the prosecutor's office in Soviet-occupied Bernburg, they requested Eberl's arrest on December 30, 1947. He was taken into custody under the American military government. However, his identity could not be clarified. On January 17, 1948, Eberl was identified by the former Bernburg nurse Erna Schwarz in a police photo. Later, another nurse who had previously worked at the Greifneck Euthanasia Institution also recognized Eberl in a photograph presented to her during an interrogation at the Tübingen State Criminal Police Office on February 9, 1948. Finally, before being brought to trial, Eberl decided to take his own life on February 16, 1948, by hanging himself in his cell at Ulm prison. At that time, the investigating authorities still had no knowledge of the deceased prisoner's true identity. Immo Eberl, the scholar who never got involved in his family history. Immo Eberl, born in 1947, is the second son of the euthanasia practitioner and first commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp, Irmfried Eberl, and his second wife, Gerda Friederike Eberl, née Poppendick. Of course, Immo never knew his father, as he took his own life a year after the boy was born, so contact was non-existent. This allowed him to live a life far removed from the shadow of any Nazi ties, and young Immo grew up to become a highly respected academic in his hometown. Immo Eberl graduated from the Ursprung School in Schelklingen-Ursprung in 1967 and studied history, German studies, and law at the University of Tübingen until 1973, with canon law as a minor. In 1972, he received the title of Magister Artium and passed the state examination. In 1976, he received his doctorate with the dissertation on the history of the Benedictine monastery of Ursprung, located near the town of Schelklingen. From 1973 to 1974, he was head of the Third Presidential Department of the Central Administration at the University of Tübingen. From 1974 to 1987, he was a research assistant at the Historical Seminar of the Department of Medieval History. In 1986, he completed his habilitation at the University of Tübingen and became a private lecturer at the Faculty of History. His research always focused on the history of monasteries and orders, the late Middle Ages, and regional history. Interestingly, despite being a respected historian, he never decided to delve into modern German history, Nazism, or the Holocaust. Between 1987 and 1989, he served as Director General of the Danube Swabian Institute for History and Regional Studies, an agency of the Ministry of the Interior of Baden-Württemberg. In 1989, he was appointed Councillor of the Municipal Archives and Director of the Municipal Archives of the large city district of Ellwangen, a position he held until his retirement in 2015. Eberl's private life is completely unknown, except that he is married to a schoolteacher and has a son. However, Immo never wanted to talk about his views on Nazism or on his father. It is likely that, having never met him, the whole matter was extremely foreign to him, but due to his extensive qualifications and academic prestige in Germany, many journalists have tried to interview him without success. A son's plea. Uwe K&ouml, the son of the bitch of Buchenwald, who sought forgiveness from his mother. Finally, we'll close this list with a man who, in the mid-70s, wanted to clear his mother's name. Uwe K&ouml was born in 1947 in the Landsberg prison hospital while her mother, the brutal Ilse Koch, was awaiting trial for crimes against humanity. Koch was a convicted war criminal, the widow of a concentration camp commandant, Karl Koch, and known after World War II as the Bitch of Buchenwald. Uwe K&ouml, who bore his mother's maiden name, was born in the hospital attached to Landsberg prison, where his mother was awaiting trial in an American court. Uwe was not the son of Karl Otto Koch, who had been executed by the Germans in 1945. His father was also a German prisoner captured by the Allies. After birth, the boy was almost immediately taken to foster care in Bavaria and grew up in various foster homes, unaware of the identity of his parents. At age 8, in 1955, he happened to see his mother's name on her birth certificate and committed it to memory. 11 years later, he saw a headline, "No pardon for you, Koch," in the Fränkische Landeszeitung, a regional newspaper in Ansbach, where Uwe was studying at the time moment. It occurred to him that she might be his mother, a fact he immediately confirmed with his state-appointed guardian. The tall, stocky young man met his mother in the last year of her life when he was 19, and only by more or less accidental circumstances. At Christmas 1966, he went, he said, with a feeling of chills to the Bavarian prison where his mother was serving the life sentence imposed by the Bavarian State Court in 1950. They had what he described as a joyful reunion, and he continued to visit her as often as the rules allowed, which was about once a month until she hanged herself on September 1st, 1967, 3 weeks before his 61st birthday after 22 years in prison. Ilse Koch's case was truly unique, and that's why it took so long for her sentence to be served. The Bitch of Buchenwald was denounced within the Nazis and later by the Allies for mistreatment, murder and torture of Jewish prisoners at the Buchenwald concentration camp, which led to several investigations against her and her husband before the end of the war. In 1944, after 16 months of investigative arrest, a special SS court dropped the charges against Ilse for causing the deaths of Buchenwald prisoners, since she was simply the wife of the commandant and held no administrative position there. Nevertheless, her husband was found guilty and shot. In 1947, after the war ended, a US military tribunal convicted Mrs. Koch of beating, torturing, and executing prisoners at Buchenwald, as well as participating in the selection of other prisoners for execution or gassing. During investigations at the extermination camp and the compound where the Kochs lived, the Allies found lamps and artifacts fashioned from the skin of Holocaust victims. From this, stories began to emerge implying that Ilse was a completely perverted woman who held orgies, forced prisoners to participate, and requested that tattooed prisoners be skinned to create these artifacts from their skin. Despite these testimonies, a year later, a review board convened by the US military governor, General Lucius D. Clay, concluded that most of the evidence against her was hearsay and reduced her sentence from life with hard labor to 4 years. After her release in 1949, she was retried by the West Germans and sentenced once again to life imprisonment on 2 counts of inciting to murder Buchenwald prisoners. None of the 3 tribunals could establish any connection between Mrs. Koch and the Buchenwald tattooed skins used to make lampshades and other items. But by the time she was tried a 3rd time, even compelling counter-evidence couldn't separate her from the charge that she ordered prisoners to be killed and flayed because she liked their tattoos. Dr. Morgan, who testified against her at all 3 trials, claims today that virtually the same allegations were made, evidence against him in each of them. In a telephone interview at his law office in Frankfurt, he claimed that the charges related to the tattooed skins were based on pure hearsay. Taking this as a reference, Uwe K&ouml attempted to outline a posthumous defense of his mother. In 1971, K&ouml requested an interview with the New York Times, where he argued that Ilse Koch had been treated unfairly because the 3 courts that tried her could not gather evidence establishing that she had committed serious crimes. During the conversation, he discussed the brief relationship he had with his mother. "I always avoided talking to her about the war," he recalled. "She always denied her guilt and said she'd been the victim of defamation, lies, and perjury. I never spoke to her again because it hurt her. I wanted my mother to have hope of getting out, and secondly, that after 2 decades in prison, she would have other ideas." After his mother died, Uwe sought a review of the case by the West German Supreme Court and posthumously rehabilitate her by reducing the life sentence imposed in 1950, but he didn't really have the legal tools to do so. For that reason, he attempted to generate a kind of rehabilitation through the press, clearing Ilse Koch's name. However, he had his doubts. "I can't imagine what the war was like back then," he continued. "I'm not even convinced she was innocent. But I feel like she just slipped into the world of concentration camps like so many others without being able to do anything about it." In any case, he doesn't deny all the charges his mother faced, but rather acknowledges the reputation she gained as a sex addict and pervert. She was no innocent angel. She was a hussy who rode horses in sexy underwear in front of prisoners, and then, as punishment, recorded the number of those who looked at her. She lay in her garden in front of the prisoners, but she had nothing to do with the lampshade business and didn't deserve such a drastic punishment. She was the victim of horror stories. Uwe K&ouml wasn't asking for clemency for her mother, but she wanted to record another point of view. When the New York Times asked her why she wanted them to publish the interview, K&ouml replied, "I think that since the Americans sentenced her to life in prison and then reduced her sentence to 4 years, American readers should know her side of the story." After that, K&ouml fell silent. She is known to have gone into business, but she never spoke publicly about her mother again, nor did she defend the legacy of the Bitch of Buchenwald.